A feat of Victorian engineering, the Manx Electric Railway continues to attract visitors to the Isle of Man as part of the island's unique network of heritage transport. First opened in 1893, the MER celebrated its 125th birthday this week, and the anniversary was marked by 8 days of events and activities. There were special timetables, a mail tram reenactment and the launch of commemorative stamps, and a chance to see almost every piece of rolling stock available for passenger use in a cavalcade through Laxey. But it was on Monday when the culmination of more than 3 years of hard work by volunteers and Isle of Man Railway staff was celebrated, with the reintroduction of the newly restored ratchet car number 14. It was officially unveiled at Derby Castle by Director of Transport Services Ian Longworth, before setting off on its inaugural journey to Laxey Station.
It's a great occasion, this, to relaunch 14 back into service. I'm told that it hasn't run in service for 40 years. And one of a number of trams that were parked up when the visitor numbers discovered ensuite bathrooms in Benidorm. You'll have seen the picture of what we started with, and it's a tremendous achievement after 3.5 years and thousands of hours, both within the staff and within the volunteers, that we have this magnificently restored 1898 car. They said we'll go back to 1898 condition with no paint. I thought that has added years to the job, which it did. So 3.5 years later, the tram looks fantastic, and can I invite the staff and the volunteers to board for the first journey?
Andrew Scarf, I work in the engineering office at Isle of Man Railways, but today I'm driving tram number 14, so I'm the driver.
Now, what is the significance of tram number 14?
Tram number 14, it's all to do with the braking system on it. All our other trams in service at the moment are stopped by a powerful air brake. There's a compressor underneath, pumps air up to a very high pressure, and to stop it you release a valve and clamps the brakes on. 14 hasn't got an air compressor or air brakes, and it's all down to stopping it by hand. You can see on the front there's a lovely brass handle on the front of the tram there. So it's all down to the muscle power of the driver, and that's how tram cars were traditionally stopped. You see these old black and white pictures of these old guys, Victorian days, standing on the front of trams, winding on these handles. So that's what we're doing. That's what's made it significant for us. It's the only one we've got in service now that's a handbrake car.
Have a look at the brake system.
You can indeed, yep. Let's have a look from here. So this lovely brass handle here is the handbrake, which I mentioned. Can you hear it clicking? That's known as a ratchet, and that's the name of these type of cars, are ratchet cars. So you wind the handle up, wind the brake on here. You can hear it clicking. Here, there at the base, like so. So that's how we stop it. We go down a hill, we just wind the handle up, and there's a very powerful linkage system underneath which puts the brakes on each wheel. We've got another one on the left hand side there, so that's called a Scotch Brake, worked by a wheel, and that's a backup, emergency backup to this one. So if we have a problem with the main handbrake, I can put the Scotch Brake on and use it to stop the tram. So we've got two braking systems on it.
And it's been out of service for what, 40 years now?
40 years. 1978, my records show it last carried a passenger. It was used for a couple of years after that as a permanent way vehicle, out on track work and stuff like that. But it got in a bit of a sorry state, so yeah, 40 years since it last carried a passenger.
What's the history of the tram itself?
It was built in 1898 by a company called George F. Milnes and Co. of Birkenhead, who was Britain's premier tramcar builder. They bought 9 of them in 1898 for the opening of the line to Ramsey. 5 became trams, 4 became trailers. So it's been in service, say, right the way through from 1898 right through to 1978.
Now, looking at today, it's unrecognisable really from the photos of it beforehand. I mean, it really was in quite a derelict state, certainly to look at.
To look at, yeah, it was indeed. Transformation's incredible. During the 3-year restoration period, we took everything we could off it in the way of, like the seats, the roof clerestories, the front dash panels, everything like that. They were all taken to our workshop here in Laxey, where they were cleaned, layers of paint varnish stripped off them, cleaned up, sanded and painted and varnished again. You look back at some of the days and evenings spent in the freezing cold shed in winter months, in dark days of February, freezing cold where your hands are numb, and you think, why are we doing this? And then you see the tram in front of us now, that's why it was worthwhile, all that effort, thousands of hours, but it's been worth it.
Now, the basic structure of this, is this typical of an Isle of Man tram?
Well, we've got two types. We've got the closed cars, which we tend to use mostly in service, and this one's an open crossbench, so it's an open-sided car, which it's not typical of a British tram car design. It's actually influenced from America, and there's very, very few tramways in Britain that had trams like this. Blackpool, for example, had a few, but it really is a design of tram that's quite unusual for Britain. As you can see, sort of as the sides are open, the pillars supporting the roof, and then the seats inside, the rows of seats which we all took out, cleaned, varnished and restored, they swing at the back, swing over, so when you get to the end of the line, we don't turn the tram round as such, just throw the seats over, turn the trolley round, take the controls to the other end and drive back the other direction.
And it must be quite a privilege to drive it, having spent so much time working on it.
Oh, incredible. It didn't, as I said, like the dark winter days of working on this over many years, you don't think the day's actually going to come and to actually stand on the front of it and put the power on for the first time and it moves. It's an amazing feeling, incredible feeling.
And it's the 125th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway. 125 years. What was it like when it first started? You weren't there, obviously.
Well, I don't think we can really appreciate what it was like when it started. Right back in 1893, if you look back at that time, it must have been like science fiction, I think, for people in the Isle of Man, because this new contraption had come along called electric tram. And if you think about it, up to that time, every sort of mode of transport had a visible power source, be it a sail on a boat or a horse in front of you or a steam loco that was belching out steam and smoke. The tram has got no visible motive power. You put a trolley on a wire, turn a handle and it moves, and that must have been an incredible thing for the people back in 1893 to witness and try and understand how it was working. In the last 125 years it's played a vital role in carrying tourists, and also we mustn't forget the residents, because out in places like Macclesfield and the remote farming areas, it was a vital form of transport which ran every day of the year, including Christmas Day, before motor buses and motor cars came along, and it's still here with us today for us all to enjoy.
Andrew Scarf of Isle of Man Railways, who was part of the team of volunteers who worked on the project to restore car number 14. But it was Friday that marked 125 years to the day when, on September the 7th, 1893, the first ever journey on the Manx Electric Railway was taken, travelling from Douglas to Groudle. To mark the anniversary, a commemorative plaque was unveiled by the Lieutenant Governor, Sir Richard Gosney, before the journey was reenacted using the oldest car in the fleet, car number 1. The unveiling, which drew a large crowd of visiting enthusiasts, took place at Derby Castle, where the Stationmaster is Phil Stiles. So what's the role of the Stationmaster?
I think primarily health and safety of the public. You've seen we shunt trams in, and the public and the trams are in very close proximity, so I try to keep people out of the way, supervising the booking clerk who does the ticket sales, and it's generally running and managing the site.
And you must get to meet an awful lot of people who are keen on trams and trains. What kind of response do you get from visitors?
Well, it's very positive. I would say 99.9% of the comments I get from the public generally is extremely positive. You know, things like this is the best day out of it I've had for the money I've spent, sort of thing. Very positive comments. So yeah, it's very motivational doing a job where people seem to enjoy what you're providing.
We came over for the anniversary from Hamburg in Germany, yes, and therefore I find it very interesting, I must say. I had several rides on the tram as well as on the summit of the Snaefell.
This is the 6th time I'm here. First time was in the 70s already, and I work as a motorman on the Swedish Tramway Museum. And I never get bored of going here. It's so old, it's the original, it's like it has been for more than 100 years. And I don't think you can find this anywhere else in the world.
I've come from Blackpool. Yes, I help on the heritage trams at Blackpool, so we've come across to support this event. Met up with some friends from America, Poland, Germany, so all come specially for this. Yeah, it's a big draw for people to come across and visit the island.
We're here on holiday, but we chose this time to come on holiday because of the celebration. 1972 was our first visit over here, and I got hooked then. Other places it seems to be preserved, but here it's just authentic and smashing.
My name's Steve Hall and I'm a Derby Castle supervisor.
People love nostalgia, don't they?
Oh, very much so, yeah, myself included really. So yeah, it's they are very historical and the team really care for the trams. As you can see, the whole fleet does well in excess of 100,000 miles a year, which I think surprises people when they do come on the tours in the yard. But the history side of it, yeah, there is plaques. We've got information sheets on all the trams and trailers now, and you know, it just brings a bit of life and a bit of interest to the people. Like number one's the oldest tram in service, which obviously we're celebrating today with 1893. Today is the day that 125 years ago it actually left Derby Castle under no ceremony like we're having today, and it ran through to Grouda, which is fantastic. You know, the Isle of Man history, it's something that we should all embrace.
2 or 3 things strike me about this 125th anniversary, and they're all, I think, unique. It's an overused word, but I think they are. The first is the sheer innovation that was involved in 1893. Okay, so Blackpool had their fun and games a few years earlier in the 1880s, but theirs was flat along the promenade. It was dead easy. They weren't doing a 1 in 24 up to Onchan Head, and then 1 in 24 down again Charlestown to get to Groudle Glen, let alone all the other things. The second thing, this was at the very early stages of electricity at all, and doing it in a way that no one had done before. No one had tried that sort of gradient. And the speed with which the thing was built. Okay, the island was filling up fast with tourists, and they wanted to, but they got not just to Groudle Glen, but they got to Laxey within a year. I think they were in Laxey by 1884 or so, and Ramsey by 1888. 5 years. Well, you compare that with modern day, and there we are in the United Kingdom. People are sorting out HS2. Is that what it's called, the new railway? There, it takes them about 5 years to form the committee and decide, let alone decide. I shouldn't have said that, should I? Let alone decide what the route should be. And this whole thing was done in 5 years. The third and final thing was the fluctuating fortunes, not just up and down physically, but up and down financially. 20,000 people in the first 17 days in the short period it was open. Just to Groudle Glen, and the first year in 1893, I've been told that, you know, years later, one of the heydays, the mid-1920s, what was it, about 750,000 people a year. That's extraordinary. And again, in the mid-late 40s, after the Second World War. And yet, 10 years later, your predecessors had to step in, Minister, for the first time and nationalise it, because they ran out of money. And 20 years after that, it was even closed for one season, at least from Laxey on to Ramsey, because the money wasn't there. But now, thanks to the benevolence of the government and Tynwald, it is a good going concern for a long season through the summer, and I noted in the paper today that you've even managed to, thanks to lots of volunteer work, put back on the rails one of the very early cars. Was it car 14? So it's clearly a flourishing enterprise for the tourists now. Okay, that's quite enough. I'm going to unveil the plaque to mark the 125th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway tramway.
Tram number 1, the major original journey.
Well, car number 1 was one of 3 supplied in 1893, which were built by G.F. Milnes of Birkenhead and supplied to the Isle of Man Tramway and Electric Power Company for the new electric railway between Derby Castle and Groudle Glen. Obviously today we're celebrating the 125th anniversary, so number 1 can still be seen in use into its 3rd century and shares a Guinness Book of Record with car number 2 as the oldest trams in the world still in operation on their original line. Something that a lot of people don't realise, that the history we have of the cars, and only that number 3 got destroyed in 1930 in the fire at Laxey. You know, we would have all 3 cars which were first delivered in 1893.
Well, Your Excellency, Minister, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, my name's Charles Gard, and I've been asked to say a few words as a result of this historic journey you've just undertaken. The replica of the first service tram on the 7th of September 1893, 125 years ago, from Derby Castle to Groudle. Now, I was going to say that I thought the only difference would have been that there had been a lot more top hats in those days, but in fact it wasn't the opening ceremony. That took place the next year when the tramway had gone through to Laxey. The reason was the directors had been so keen to get this running all summer that by the time it was ready, they only had 17 days to go before the end of the season. They just said, get it going. But even in those few first days, they managed to take 20,000 passengers between Derby Castle and Gradle, which is incredible.
And how much?
Oh, a few pence.
Three old pence.
3 old pence, but that tellingly didn't go to the government because no government money went into this at all. This was built by a group of entrepreneurs. And the thing that made it possible was the tourist industry, which was booming. 1880s had seen an enormous increase in the people coming here. And by the time we got to the Edwardian period, we were routinely having over 650,000 visitors a year to the Isle of Man. So virtually anything you did, building boarding houses, dance halls, theatres, developing all these glens, could hardly fail because you just had tens of thousands of customers every year. So we had businessmen and entrepreneurs, a perfect combination with some technical expert. We had Alexander Bruce, who was the managing director of Dumble's Bank, Frederick Saunderson, who was a railway engineer from Northern Ireland, and the Hopkinson brothers from Manchester, who were experts on developing electric traction. Now, of course, any self-respecting city in those days either had or wanted to have a tram system. But going on this tramway was totally different from going to work in Manchester or Gateshead. These trams took you to fantastic places, wonderful amusements, and through some of the finest countryside in the British Isles. And it was built astonishingly quickly, considering the engineering problems that challenged the developers. Derby Castle, before 1893, the promenade finishes at the castle. There is the little dance hall and the hotel, but beyond that were sea cliffs just like you've seen here at Gradle. There was no road to Port Jack. There was simply the end of the prom. 3 years later, by the time the team had started, there was an absolute transformation there. A new sea wall had been built, much land had been reclaimed. In fact, the Derby Castle were able to build their theatre, and they forged a road around the coast here to Gradle, an astonishing amount of work. On the Isle of Man in those days, there was no electric power. If you wanted power at your theatre or in your hotel, you had to generate your own power. And all these places had flatbed engines driven by gas or other fuel and attached to dynamos making their own power. So this company had to build the island's first power station, which they did at Derby Castle. They built a second one at Laxey when they got through there, and a third one up at Ballaglass for the Northern Line, and a fourth one when they built the separate railway altogether of Snaefell. Very quickly, they were supplying electricity to anyone who wanted it. To hotels and houses along the line. They did the electric street lighting in Onken and right up to Onken Church. In fact, if you were there on a Sunday night having evensong and the lights flickered and dimmed, you knew that the tram was pulling out from Derby Castle. And to help with all of that, here at Laxey, with another extraordinary innovation, there was a wooden shed. We're not quite sure where it was, but it had in it 240 huge chloride batteries that were on standby to supply extra power instantly if more trams than were scheduled were running, and they were recharged in between. So what inspired this to be built? Well, as I mentioned, it was the island's fortune. The island was experiencing this extraordinary opportunity. We had done with smuggling. We were extremely good at that and made an enormous amount of money, but rather truculently, I feel, the British government confiscated the Isle of Man from the Duke of Atholl in 1765 and passed the Mischief Act to stop us doing it. The mining, which was the next great industry, was beginning to falter in the late 1880s. But what was starting to be realised by people was this extraordinary gift from the UK, these hundreds of thousands of people that came across. And the railway was built, as I say, in a response to this amazing opportunity. I mentioned earlier it was a private venture, and that meant that the developers could just get on with the job. As opposed to another organisation, and I've just found this little cutting in the newspaper in the early 1900s, which I think says it all. It said, after discussing the whole question of electricity for a year, Douglas Corporation have finally decided to pay someone £50 to come over to tell them something about it. Now, I think that's the first recorded instance of a consultant being brought into the Isle of Man, usually from the UK and usually to tell us what local people could have told them anyway, because these people knew an enormous amount about electric traction, and what they didn't know they experimented with. In fact, what was going on here was talked about in the electrical press, in the engineering fraternity across the world, because we here were at the cutting edge of technology. Was it a success? Well, as I've said, in the first few days, it carried 20,000 people. Next year, it was carrying through to Laxey 78,000 passenger journeys a week. Absolutely astonishing. And the combined passenger figures for the railway and the tramway, the horse tramway, which they owned a couple of years later in 1895, was 1,923,316. Actually, that's pretty good bookkeeping as well, if you can find it down to that. On a single day, the electric tramway could have up to 10,000 passenger journeys. And these were return journeys, of course, but the cars were regularly bringing 4,000 or 5,000 people into Laxey every day. That must have had an astonishing effect on the village. It was a triumph, and it's amazing that it's still with us here today. Other electric tramways have come and gone or have been changed so much they bear little resemblance to their original form. This is the oldest electric tramway in the world, still operating on its original route with its original rolling stock. And this very car you're sitting in, which did that journey on the 7th of September 1893, holds a place in the Guinness World Record Book as being the oldest operational electric tram car in the world, still operating on its original line. The Isle of Man has inherited an extraordinary collection of world-beating heritage items. We have the world's oldest continuous parliament, the world's longest operating commercial shipping line, a unique camera obscura. There's only one like that in the world, and it's on Douglas Head. We have Frank Matcham's finest ever Victorian theatre. We have the oldest surviving horse tramway, passenger tramway still running. We have, frankly, the greatest water wheel ever built on the planet. That's what we've got at Laxey. And of course we have this sole surviving electric tramway. All actually now owned by the government. We may take this for granted, but I can tell you the world watches what we do with all this, and it is crucially important that we keep investing in it. So what of the future? Well, I was born on the promenade in a Douglas boarding house. I remember the 1950s very well. I remember the tens of thousands of people coming over. We had the hydro, we had 180 guests, we were cooking 500 meals a day. The whole routine was extraordinary. The laundry, the staff, everything that was happening. And of course, sadly, that has dwindled a great deal, and we're now marketing ourselves in a different way. But I just wondered the other day when we were thinking about this very hot summer and global warming, will the British seaside holiday come back? If we can guarantee these hot summers in the future, people find they don't need to go to Turkey or Greece anymore, they can come back to the British seaside resorts. And with that in mind, I just asked the question, do we really want 650,000 visitors here every year? Of course, the Treasury would be delighted, but it is a thought, and we may yet again have to adapt. So it's been through difficult times, this rail. It was nationalised in 1957, and in 1975, an MHK took the very injudicious decision to close part of the line between Laxey and Ramsey. There was an absolute public outcry. And next year, in the general election, he lost his seat. The next year, in 1977, the whole system was restored. I just mentioned that as a warning. And since then, a great deal of money has been invested in this railway, and I, for one, as a taxpayer, am absolutely delighted. I think we all remember earlier this century, things did become very run down on the system, and there was an actual crisis 10 or 12 years ago. It's then that Tynwald decided to pour some millions into the restoration and the upgrading of this railway. And I have to say now that this wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the support of the various ministers, for the department, and of course for Tynwald, who have thoroughly supported this in years gone by. The remarkable staff, all of whom are transport enthusiasts, the teams of volunteers who restore vehicles and paint them, and you'll notice how brilliant the liveries are. Steve Hall and his team down at Derby Castle do a superb job. They all look magnificent. Now, of course, you can spend a great deal of money on anything, but unless you spend it wisely and in a properly focused way, much of it will be wasted. You need someone with drive, determination and vision to make it all happen. And fortunately, the Isle of Man has had just that person in its Director of Transport, Mr. Ian Longworth. Now, Ian's due to retire shortly, but he leaves behind him an amazing legacy. I've had the privilege of sitting with him on one or two committees, and I was astonished by his extraordinary knowledge of all things transport. This was early on to do with the horse tram takeover, and I mean, he could quote to us arcane facts like the distance a member of the public is prepared to walk with their shopping to a bus stop. But that sort of information is vital if you're putting together a transport infrastructure that really serves the community. You will see him being practical. He'll drive these trams or the steam trains or a horse tram, and I've seen him cleaning out the grit in the rails down at Derby Castle. He gets down there with the team. And as I say, what he leaves behind is a remarkable and astonishing legacy, and we must be very grateful to him, the department, and to Tynwald for all that's happened. I think I've heard several senior staff say that the bookings this year are extraordinary, but already next year they've gone up by 20%. The cruise ships, the coach tours, the groups that are coming over are rediscovering the marvels that we have on the Isle of Man. This is our unique selling point. The island is so unique that we really have something to work towards to make it even more successful. So I can only say, on behalf of us all, that we all hope this remarkable piece of heritage will be around for many years to come. And before we get hit by the service tram coming through from Laxey, I'd like to thank you all very much for your support and for being here today. And then I'll ask Andrew to drive us back to Derby Castle, where it all started 125 years ago. Thank you.
Maintaining a line like this must be difficult.
Yeah, it is. We have obviously a crew that just do the maintenance on all the lines, the Snaefell, the MER and the Steamway, and we have a dedicated wire team. At the end of the day, we still work down in the Victorian shed. We have some of the original Victorian machinery, certainly a lot of the Victorian tools. We are the custodians of where we work, and we are still working in them conditions, but it is a fantastic place to work. We try to be as much of a one-stop shop as we can, because we can't go and buy our spares off the shelf. A lot of our spares are bespoke, made by the guys on site, so that we actually engineer and manufacture and make a lot of the bits for the trams ourselves.
Now that's an almost forgotten skill in a lot of places, I imagine.
It is, yeah. Guys who leave school now, really the sort of computer industry has taken us over. We have this year actually taken on apprentices, and it was quite encouraging to see that we have a lot of people who applied for the jobs, not only younger people but mature people as well, because at the end of the day the workforce gets older. We're only custodians of these magnificent trams, and one day we'll be handing it over to the younger generation. So it is encouraging when we get young people, and we have an awful lot of volunteers and school work experience people who come down, and when they've done their work experience they come down and they actually volunteer to come and work on the trams, which is very, very encouraging. Now, you've seen today and the events that we've had for the 125, it is very much, it's still in the public eye and has been supported very, very well. The trams are going up the hill fully loaded, and it's very, very encouraging, and long may it continue.
Derby Castle Supervisor Steve Hall, and before him, historian Charles Gard. And one of that younger generation, which is set to continue to look after the MER in the future, is apprentice engineer Cade Williamson, who has also been involved in the MER Museum at Derby Castle as a volunteer.
We've got a number of artefacts on display. In front of us there we've got a board which charts the history of all the rolling stock and the different types of rolling stock, from the trams to the trails and the different bits of freight stock we've had over the years. We've got several old artefacts, so that's in front of us there is a dynamo. That's from when the line first opened, when it used to generate its own power. Got various parts of the trams and different uniforms from all over the decades and all that, so there's lots to see. There's an armature there which is part of the motor from one of the trams, so there's all sorts to see. You've got a very early welder there from pretty much the opening of the line, so there's lots of information to see here.
And looking around here, there are all sorts of signs and posters. They seem to capture each era of the MER.
Yeah, they've all been found in people's lofts or in storage, in the stations as well. They all sort of date from different eras and times, so with different tourist industries. So you've got some from the 60s, from as early as the 40s, and as late as like the 80s and 1980s and stuff. So it's really good that we've been able to salvage it all and put it on display for the public to see. We've got lots of historical photos as well, which is quite handy to look back on sometimes when you're trying to look at, in the winter when we repaint the trams, you can sort of look at that and say, oh well, that's where that lining went out, or this is what size the number was.
And do each of the trams have an identity of their own, essentially?
Yeah, each tram's pretty much different. They're obviously some like the same class kind of thing, but each tram has its own sort of personality and they've all got their unique characteristics about themselves.
And how many were actually built to run on the line and how many survive?
In total there were 33 built, but now there's only 26 that survive. And of the now those 26, there's 14 that are in regular service.
As an apprentice, what sort of things are you learning?
I'm learning all the mechanical side of them, so I'm involved in all the daily servicing, the daily maintenance of them, so everything from the brakes, from changing the brake blocks on them, to right up until when we're doing motor changes and putting new wheel sets in and all that. So it's a huge range of skills you're learning down here.
And I suppose it's the kind of skills that you won't see used in other areas because the trams are 125 years old.
Yeah, it's quite a unique skill set because you've got to mix old with new, because obviously all the components on the trams are pretty much the original components, but you've got to also try and make new ones as best you can and as best as you can suit, because obviously the trams were built in the days of Imperial and Whitworth, and now in the modern era of metric measurements, so it's trying to find the best equivalent some of the time. It's quite challenging, but it's good fun at the same time.
Apprentice engineer Cade Williamson. Of course, keeping 125 years of heritage in modern day usage must be quite an undertaking. Andrew Cowie is Chief Engineer for Isle of Man Transport.
As you can imagine, there's a lot of technical challenges involved with trying to keep rolling stock of that sort of age in a safe, reliable and efficient condition. The team do a really marvellous job all the time keeping the rolling stock working well.
And in terms of maintaining the lines, I mean, what kind of work is involved in that? Because it seems to be a sort of a constant rolling programme.
Very much so, yes. I mean, the line's been in position for a long time, and we do a detailed asset assessment of the condition of all parts of the line, and we look to renew or replace or refurbish as much line as we can. We also have to consider the overhead lines as well. Many people don't realise that, but it's as well as the ground-based stuff, there's stuff in the air as well, and there's a whole infrastructure behind that as well that supplies the power for the trams, and that also has to be kept in peak condition, and the safety critical components within that need to be operated and tested on a regular basis.
It must be quite something maintaining that, making sure that it all runs smoothly.
Well, very much so, yes. We've got age of the assets and inclement weather to fight. It is fairly exposed, and we get a lot of sea salt and spray, which does increase the corrosion, the deterioration of the tracks. We have drainage issues, particularly on likes of Snaefell and some of the more remote MER areas. During the winter we have to make sure that's managed and we keep the ballast clear. So there's a number of challenges, and again, for example, Snaefell in the off-season in the winter is challenging.
All worthwhile in the end though?
Very much so, yes. It's great to work as part of this team actually. They're all dedicated to keeping the railways running and keeping our customers happy.
Chief Engineer for Isle of Man Transport, Andrew Cowie. We'll be back shortly with more from the celebrations to mark the 125th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway. All this week, celebrations have been taking place to mark the 125th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway. As we've heard, the line to Groudle first opened in September 1893 and was extended to Laxey the following year. One of the most ambitious feats this week to mark the celebrations was a carefully coordinated cavalcade of the MER rolling stock which took place in Laxey on Friday afternoon. Commentator for the event was Charles Gard.
Coming into the station now, a trio of rolling stock, car 5, trailer 42 and wagon 8. The second year of operation, 1894, Milnes supplied 6 trams, numbers 4 to 9, for the opening of the extension here to Laxey. Similar to cars 1 and 2, the new trams were fitted with cabs for the drivers, as they were intended for year-round service. And due to the long and narrow interior, they quickly gained the nickname of tunnel cars. In 1932, this car received upholstered swing-over seats in place of the wooden benches, so it could be used as a backup to the winter saloons.
Yes. We're all tram enthusiasts. We're all involved with the Tramway Museum, which is in Derbyshire. So it's a lifelong passion of trams. And we've all been to the Isle of Man many times to see the trams here. This is a special occasion because it's the 125th anniversary. And so we've decided that we will come here and enjoy the wonderful celebrations that have now been taking place. We have come for this celebration, so the highlight has been to see the whole fleet, the whole operating fleet of the Manx Electric in this cavalcade. You can't do better than that, because then we can photograph it and be the typical tram enthusiasts.
That it survived with its original rolling stock. I mean, that's the really significant thing, isn't it? That none of it has ever been replaced. It's as bought.
As opposed to some of the other older tramways in the world, they've all been modernised. This one hasn't. From the vehicle point of view, I mean, obviously the operating procedures have been modernised.
But is that part of the fascination?
Well, it's unique, isn't it? Because it is original. As Frank says, it's absolutely the original rolling stock, and nowhere in the world is it quite like this. And it has survived on the skin of its teeth, because it nearly closed in the 50s, and if it hadn't have been for the Manx government, it wouldn't be here now.
And that would be such a loss. And of course the same thing almost happened recently with the horse trams, didn't it? And I think it's important, excuse me, it's important to preserve a heritage, very important. And I think there's a link also with what we do, because at the Tramway Museum in Derbyshire, we have some similar vehicles. In fact, some of them are almost identical.
Yes.
Because they were also built by the same firm at the same time. Yes. So that's just a personal link for us. Yes.
So you're enjoying your time here on the Isle of Man?
Absolutely. Oh yes.
Very much,
Well, we're not going back till Sunday, so we're going to get some more railways in. We're going on the Groudle Glen Railway soon, and when we get back to Douglas, we're going to ride on the horse tram.
Indeed.
The beer's pretty good as well.
So what you've witnessed is, I think, an extraordinary cavalcade of remarkable vintage trams, trailers and wagons running along the oldest surviving commercial electric tramway in the world. All of you here, both locals and those of you who always support us by coming across from other countries, your support is extremely important and very much appreciated by everyone involved on this railway, and its continued support is absolutely essential to secure the future of this extraordinary system.
Andrew Scarf, motorman, tram driver.
It's been quite an impressive display of the stock here today.
Has been, Catherine. What an incredible spectacle. Almost every piece of rolling stock that we've got at the moment available for passenger use has been included in the cavalcade today. Incredible sight.
It's an amazing array of cars, really. I mean, they're all different. You would think that they would be standard.
No, I mean, when we get them all together in a cavalcade like this, it does actually show you how many different types there are, and I think it shows up to advantage all the different historical liveries. They're not all red and white. There's a real load of different liveries, and then so it made a lovely spectacle, really good.
And the logistics of getting them all out and having the cavalcade through Laxey must have been interesting.
It was an organisational challenge, to say the least, because we're still operating a passenger service during the day as well. We're not just having a cavalcade for the benefit of all the people here today. There's passengers still to be carried between Douglas and Ramsey. We had to sit down very carefully, and one of my colleagues in the traffic department made a superb job of coming up with a working timetable. So what we had to do was send them off from Derby Castle in the morning in a certain order, shunt, which has changed the direction of the trams, some of them at Doon Quarry, and the rest went through to Ramsey. So we had to make sure that the ones coming in at Doon Quarry fit amongst the ones coming through to Ramsey, so when they all got to Laxey they were lined up in numerical order, and we achieved it.
And now you've got to get them all back to where they came from.
That's indeed. All the trams, but at some point we'll be back at Derby Castle Depot tonight, and all the, well, hundreds, maybe thousands of people here today, they'll be all carried back as well.
Driver Andrew Scarf, and before that, visitors from Derbyshire, Andrew, Roger and Frank. As we've heard on the programme, the Manx Electric Railway's had its ups and downs during its 125-year history. But what is its value to the Isle of Man today? We'll hear from the Infrastructure Minister Ray Harmer shortly, but first, Director of Transport Services Ian Longworth.
They are a tourist attraction, they bring a lot of people to the island. Since we started promoting to groups, off-island tourism has increased significantly in this sector, and the ridership of the railways 10 years ago was under 300,000 and it's now over 500,000. Snaefell in itself has gone up from 36,000 to 62,000 last year, and we're about 20% up on last year at the minute. And this is selling to groups, and the groups are selling holidays to people either directly as enthusiasts or more the closet enthusiast that brings his wife on holiday. Oh, there's a tramway.
It's quite a different take on things than they used to be in the past.
Oh yes, it's the railways contribute something approaching 15 million to the GDP of the island. You know, the top two tour operators both sell it as Heritage Railways, the holiday here for 5 days. They're not selling cheap holidays. They start in the shoulder season at £700 and £800 for 5 days, and that will contribute 17,000 bed nights, those two operators, to the economy of the island, which is just brilliant.
They do really play a significant part in the tourism offer here.
Yes, the island is about heritage, and between Manx National Heritage and the railways, they are the key attraction of the island in the current day.
What this week has really demonstrated is the massive attraction, because we've got something really special, really, really unique that isn't anywhere in the world. I think we sometimes forget what we've got, and the numbers and people flocking, you know, whole families coming from across the other side of the world is quite amazing. So it really, really is special, and I think the other thing that hits me is the fact that it's both about history but also about innovation at the time. It's very cutting edge, and I think that's the space where we sit. We've got to remember this is hugely significant for the island. All of our heritage railways are hugely significant, and I think we've got to treasure them and build them. It's the reason why people come. It also makes us very unique and makes us very special, and it's very much part of our culture. So it almost has an intrinsic value that you can't really put a number on.
So, as the island celebrates the longevity of the Manx Electric Railway, just how significant is it that the MER has survived for 125 years? Historian Charles Gard.
I don't think they would ever have thought that a century and a quarter later it would still be running. And we now know that all the other tram systems in the world have gone and been replaced or been so dramatically altered that they don't bear any relation to their original form, which leaves this actually in the Guinness Book of Records as being the sole surviving electric tram from that period. And that speaks for itself. It was so brilliantly engineered, and it was such a success to begin with, and then the government took it over, and, you know, fair dues, they've paid for it ever since, and they've brought it up to a fantastic standard. And it's a piece of world heritage that everyone should know about.
And given what has been lost in the past in the Isle of Man, it's quite astonishing that it is still here and it is still running.
Yes, it's a fluke in a way. I don't know why we've lost the Douglas to Ramsey line on the steam train. We have lost things, but some have been retained, and I don't know if there's any rule that you can say has been applied. The Camera Obscura, that's the unique in the world, the horse trams, the Great Laxey Wheel, and the Gaiety Theatre. Now, you see, the theatre was about to be demolished. It had a demolition order on it in the 70s. And it was only the secretary of the Palace and Derby Castle Company who refused to sign that order on the Friday that stopped it being demolished on the following Monday. The Laxey Wheel was up for sale for scrap. But a local resident, Mr. Neil, bought it, God bless him, and ran it, and then the government took it over. So these are flukes, to be honest, and you can't really analyse why it's happened. We just must be grateful that it has.
Historian Charles Gard bringing to an end this special programme looking back at some of the celebrations to mark the 125th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway. Our thanks to everyone who contributed to the programme and helped to make it possible.